survived the shark attacks of 1916. This historical fiction was written by Lauren Tarshish and read to you by me, Mrs. Elkins. Hello, All Stars. It's me, Mrs. Elkins. I'm back this week to read more from I Survived the Shark Attacks of 1916. And as you can see, this is an accelerated reader book. It is a level 3.9, so if that is anywhere on your range after you test, you can test on this book when we're finished. At the very end of reading the whole book, I will give you the quiz number. Don't jump ahead. We're going to start today with Chapter 6. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 6. The next day, the guys came by the diner, smiling like everything was normal. Chet didn't wave back. He slipped into the kitchen before they sat down at the counter and didn't come out until they were gone. After the breakfast rush was over, Uncle Jerry handed Chet a mug of root beer and told him to have a seat. "What's wrong, kiddo?" he asked, sitting on the stool next to Chet's. "I see you've been avoiding your buddies." "They're not my buddies," Chet said. "I hardly know them." Uncle Jerry peered at Chet. "Is this because of the stun at the creek?" "You heard about that?" Chet said. Uncle Jerry chuckled, but not in a nasty way. "They didn't mean any harm," he said. "You should be flattered." "How's that?" Chet said. "They made me feel like an idiot." "It means they like you, that you're one of them," Uncle Jerry said. "Now they're expecting you to get them back. Didn't you know that's how it works?" How could Chet know? He'd never had any real friends before. He wanted to know more. But before he could ask, Mr. Colton and Dr. J came through the door. They were Uncle Jerry's oldest friends. Mr. Colton owned the hardware store. Dr. J took care of practically everyone in town. They came in every day for coffee and to chat about baseball with Uncle Jerry. But today the men didn't want to talk about Babe Ruth's pitching record. Mr. Colton held up the morning paper so Uncle Jerry and Chet could read the front page headline: "Shark Kills Second Bather in New Jersey, July 7, 1916, Spring Lake, New Jersey. A shark attacked Charles Bruder, 28, while he was swimming alone in the ocean yesterday afternoon. Lifeguards rushed to his rescue, but the young man's wounds were so severe that he bled to death before they reached shore. Bruder, a well-liked bell captain at the Essex and Sussex Hotel, was known to be a strong swimmer, but he was no match for the beast which attacked without mercy. Before he perished, Bruder was able to tell a remarkable story to his rescuers. He was a big gray fellow, as rough as sandpaper, Bruder said. I didn't see him until after he struck me the first time. That was when I yelled. I thought he had gone on, but he only turned and shot back at me and snipped my leg off. He yanked me clear under before he let go. He came back at me, and he shook me like a terrier shakes a rat." Bruder tried to say more, but he became too weak. He died of massive blood loss and shock before the lifeguards could get him back to the shore. Officials are warning people not to swim alone. "I still don't believe it," said Uncle Jerry. "Someone is cooking up these stories to sell newspapers." "Could be," Mr. Colton said. "Folks are terrified, though. My wife's cousin lives out there, and she says nobody will go near the ocean. They have fishermen out with rifles shooting at anything that moves." "You know what this reminds me of?" Dr. J said. "The Creek Devil." "What's that?" Chet asked. Mr. Colton and Dr. J chuckled, and Mr. Colton shifted his hefty body forward on the stool. He leaned closer to Chet. "Old-timers say there's a monster that lives down near the creek. He's covered with mud, eats snakes and bats, and makes a terrible hissing sound. Moans, too. Legend is that he comes out every decade and drags a kid back into the mud with him." "People believe that?" Chet said. "Everyone in town knows the legend," Uncle Jerry said, "but nobody really believes it." "Except for Jerry here," Dr. J said, slapping Uncle Jerry on the shoulder. "When we were little, he wouldn't go near that creek." "Ah," Uncle Jerry said, waving his hand at Dr. J. "I don't know what you're talking about. Doesn't someone need a wart removed or something?" Was Uncle Jerry blushing? Imagine Uncle Jerry being afraid of a made-up monster. Chet smiled to himself. Maybe there was hope for him yet. Suddenly, Chet had an idea for the greatest prank ever. Folks would be talking about it for years, and then he'd be part of the gang for sure. Dewey, Monty, and Sid were going to come face to face with Chapter 7. At church on Sunday, Chet went out of his way to say hi to the guys. They seemed relieved that he wasn't mad anymore, and the truth was, he really wasn't, now that he understood how it was with pranks, and now that he had a genius plan for getting them back. Come swimming with us today, Sid called as he helped his mother into their buggy. We'll be there right after lunch. Sure, Chet called back. I'll meet you. Uncle Jerry patted him on the back. That's the way, kiddo, he said. There's no room in a small town for grudges. Chet was dying to tell Uncle Jerry about his idea, but Chet kept his mouth shut, worried that his uncle might tell someone and spoil the plan. He saw Minnie Marston as she was leaving the churchyard. She waved to him and smiled like she wanted him to go up and talk to her. For months last spring, Chet had prayed that Minnie would look in his direction. But now, he didn't have time for girls, not even Minnie. He had to get to the creek before the guys. He waved to Minnie and headed home. Uncle Jerry was going to the diner to take care of some bookkeeping, and Chet headed home to change. He grabbed the bag he'd packed that morning. Inside was a bottle of ketchup, one of his old work boots, and the white cap he always wore at work. Everything he needed. He hurried to the creek, which was completely quiet, and he went straight to work. His plan had two parts. First, he wanted to make the guys think he'd been attacked and dragged, bloody and screaming, into the creek. He dribbled some ketchup along the dock, a trail of blood. He put his boot in the middle of the dock and covered it with ketchup. He did the same to his cap. Chet stood back and admired his work. So far, so good. Now Chet took off his undershirt and trousers and kicked off his boots. He hid them in the tall grass. Then he went to the wettest part of the bank. He scooped up handfuls of the slimiest mud he could find and smeared it onto his face, his arms, and his chest. He used extra mud to cover his head so that no hairs poked through. He had no idea what the devil creek was supposed to look like, but he was pretty sure it didn't have orange hair. Chet was just finishing when he heard voices. The guys. Chet closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he let out the biggest, loudest scream he could muster. He screamed like he was terrified, like he was in agony, and then he splashed loudly into the creek. Careful not to wash off the mud, he screamed some more, and then waded into the reeds and hid. Chet, Sid called, that you? Chet didn't answer. He couldn't see the guys, but he heard their heavy breathing and their panicky voices. Where is he? Is that his boot? What the? Oh my God, Sid whispered. Is that blood? Chet held his breath. Would they really fall for it? Could this actually work? Chet, Sid called. Chet, you there? Chet had to puff up his cheeks to keep from bursting out laughing. Isn't that Chet's cap? Dewey whispered. A few seconds went by. What's happening? Monty said quietly. They were falling for it. Now it was time for part 2. Chet gave a low hiss, remembering what Mr. Colton had said about the sound the creek devil made before an attack. What the heck was that? Dewey said, his voice shaking. Quiet, Sid said. Should we go get someone? Dewey said. Hiss. Chet was impressed by how spooky he sounded. Next, he started to moan, low at first and then louder. Whoa! He poked his head through the reeds. Not all the way, just enough for the guys to catch a glimpse of a hideous head covered in black slime. The guys stared with bugged-out eyes and wide-open mouths. Ah! They screamed. Dewey went tearing away. Oh, no! Ah! Screamed Sid and Monty. They turned to run, and that's when Chet leaped out of the water. Got you! Chet shouted. Sid and Monty stopped short. Their faces were dead white. "I got you good." He waited for their terrified faces to melt into smiles, for them to laugh their heads off and tell Chet he was a genius, but they didn't. Sid stomped onto the dock. He leaned close to Chet, his face all twisted up and furious. His fists were clenched. Chet jumped back. Was Sid going to deck him? Monty pulled him away. "He's not worth it," he said. "You're an idiot," Sid growled. "We really thought something bad happened to you." "How could you think that would be funny?" Monty said. The words came at him hard and cold. Sid glared at him a few more seconds, and then they turned and walked away. Chet stood there in shock. His prank had worked better than he could have imagined, but it was all wrong. And there he was, covered with stinking mud, all alone. Chapter 8. Chet scrubbed himself off in the creek and went back to Uncle Jerry's cottage. It was too hot to be inside, so he sat on the porch. He sat there a long time. He wondered what Mama and Papa were doing. He pictured Mama with her soft smile and laughing eyes, and Papa, who always woke up with a happy face even when they were out of money and had to pack up and start all over again. Why had they left him here? He was so deep in his gloomy thoughts that at first he didn't see Uncle Jerry hurrying up the walk. "There you are," he said, catching his breath, and he sat down next to Chet. "I thought you were going to be at the diner all day," Chet said. "I was," Uncle Jerry said, fishing in his pocket for his pipe. He struck his match on the floor, lit his pipe, took a few puffs, and then settled back. They didn't say anything for a few minutes. "So there was some excitement at the creek, I hear," Uncle Jerry said. Chet's heart sank into his boots. "Poor Dewey came running down Main Street in his drawers," Uncle Jerry continued. "He was screaming about the creek devil. His mama called Dr. J." Chet sighed. He didn't look at Uncle Jerry. He'd probably already sent a telegram to Mama and Papa and was getting ready to ship Chet directly to California. Chet couldn't wait to start packing. "I went too far," Chet said. "I guess you did," Uncle Jerry said. Chet took a deep breath. A spider scurried across the floor and disappeared into one of the cracks. Lucky spider. There was a strange sound. Chet looked at Uncle Jerry, whose face was beet red. Was he choking on his pipe smoke? No, he was laughing. His laughter exploded through the air. He pounded his chest a few times. "Sorry," he said through his guffaws. But that look on Dewey's face, he leaned forward, slapping his leg, shaking his head. "It was a good one," Uncle Jerry sputtered. "Maybe a little too gruesome, but darn good." Chet wanted to laugh along with Uncle Jerry, but he kept thinking of that furious look on Sid's face when Chet came out of the water. Monty was right. Chet wasn't worth it. He wasn't even worth a punch in the nose. He had ruined everything. Tears ran down his face. He turned away from Uncle Jerry, but it was too late. Uncle Jerry stopped laughing and put his hand on Chet's shoulder. He waited for Chet to stop crying. What a fool he was, blubbering like this, over a stupid prank. "It's all right," Uncle Jerry said. "No," Chet said, standing up. "I need to leave." "Where are you going?" Uncle Jerry said. "To California," Chet said. Uncle Jerry stared at him. "I don't belong here," Chet said. "The heck you don't," Uncle Jerry said. "You belong here, like I knew you would. Why would you think I begged your mama to let you stay with me?" "But I thought Mama asked you," Chet said. "Are you kidding? I've been begging for years. I wrote about 100 letters, a few telegrams too." "Why?" Chet said. Uncle Jerry looked at Chet like he was asked for the answer to 2 plus 2. "I thought maybe you were tired of moving around so much," Uncle Jerry said, pulling Chet back down to sit next to him on the porch step. "And there's another reason. You and I are buddies, kiddo. Always were. I was lonely without you all these years." Chet almost laughed. With all the people who loved Uncle Jerry, who crowded around him every day at the diner, who laughed at his jokes and listened to his stories, how could he be lonely? Yet Uncle Jerry's eyes, usually all crinkled up and merry, were big and serious. He meant it. Did I ever tell you what happened after I hurt my leg? Uncle Jerry said. I moved to New York City. I quit this town. I just wanted to get lost. I couldn't stand the way people looked at me here, like they pitied me, or like I'd let them down by not becoming a big baseball star. Mama never told me that, Chet said. Well, it's true, but you know what? I miss this place, and I'll tell you what I've learned. A person has to face up to things. You never solve anything by running away. Chet knew Uncle Jerry was right, but how could Chet stay here with the guys hating him so much? Uncle Jerry seemed to read his thoughts. You'll find a way to make it up to those friends of yours, he said. I know you will. Chapter 9. The next 2 days at the diner, Chet kept waiting for the guys to come in. Every time the door opened, he looked up, hoping to see them elbowing each other to be the first to the counter. They never even walked by. Chet kept trying to work up the nerve to go and find them, and finally on Wednesday he was ready. It was another scorching day, the hottest yet. After the lunch rush was over, Uncle Jerry decided to close the diner early, and all the ice in the restaurant had melted. The milk had curdled. You could just about cook a flapjack on the kitchen floor. I'm going home to stick my head under the water pump, Uncle Jerry said. Then I'm going to swing in our hammock until the sun sets. Chet said goodbye to Uncle Jerry and headed for the creek. Sure, he'd find the guys playing ball in the water, but the swimming hole was quiet. Chet realized they were still at the factory. Their shift wouldn't be over for an hour. While he was waiting, he noticed that there were still splotches of ketchup on the dock. They looked even more like blood now, like evidence of a gruesome crime. He decided to try and clean them before the guys got there, to erase all reminders of his prank. He undressed and jumped into the creek. Then he splashed water up onto the dock, hopped out of the water, and scrubbed the stains with a handful of leaves. It took 3 rounds of splashing and scrubbing to clean it up. By then, Chet was so hot that he decided to take a longer swim. It was peaceful here without everyone splashing and shouting. He floated on his back under the trees, remembering how Papa had taught him to swim in the Mississippi, how Mama sat on the banks waving and clapping. He had turned to swim back to the dock when crash! He hit something under the water. Or something hit him. Hit him so hard in the chest he couldn't breathe. What was that? An old dock plank? A snapping turtle? Had Sid sneaked up on him and smacked him? The water around him looked funny, like it was filled with red smoke. Chet looked down in shock. His entire chest was scraped and oozing blood. What could have done that to him? A cold terror rose up inside him. He suddenly had the feeling that someone, or something, was nearby watching him. And then he saw it. A gray fin. It glistened in the bright sun as it glided slowly towards him. He had to be seeing things, or could this be another prank? Were the guys getting him back? But no, this was no tile. As it got closer, Chet could see the dark shape of an enormous fin, bigger than him, even bigger than Uncle Jerry. 2 black eyes peered up through the water. Chet's heart stopped. Killer eyes. Chet took off towards the shore, pounding through the water, kicking with all his might. Finally, his feet touched the bottom. He was running now, his heart hammering, a voice booming through his mind. Get out of the water, get out of the water, get out of the water. Almost there, just a few more steps. He dove forward, landing hard in the dirt. He rolled onto his side and stared in disbelief. It was a shark, a massive shark, dirty gray on top and pure white underneath. Its jaws snapped open and closed. The teeth, jagged and needle sharp, were bigger than Chet's fingers, lined up in rows and curving inward. The shark thrashed as if it was trying to push itself onto the bank. Chet wanted to get up and run, but he was frozen to the ground. Those killer eyes stared unblinkingly at Chet. And then, with a flick of its tail, the shark thrust itself backward into the water. It hovered for a second on the surface. Then, with a whoosh of its tail, it disappeared back down the creek. Chapter 10. Chet rose to his knees and threw up. When he could stand, he staggered over to his clothes. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely button his shirt. He shoved his feet into his boots, not even trying to lace them. And then, on wobbly legs, his blood pounding in his ears, he ran up the hill and found his way to Main Street. He pushed past the ladies with their shopping baskets. He crossed the street, ignoring the honking motor car that swerved around him. A man in a buggy shouted at him to watch out. A horse whinnied. Chet barely noticed. He staggered into Mr. Colton's hardware store, tripping across the doorway and knocking over a display of watering cans. The clattering brought 3 customers to the front of the store. Mr. Colton hurried out from behind the counter. "Chet," he said worriedly, "what's wrong?" Chet opened his mouth, but he couldn't speak. "What happened?" Mr. Colton said. "Why is your shirt covered with blood? Are you bleeding? Who did this to you?" A small group of customers clustered around him, their eyes filling with concern. Finally, Chet got the words out. "A shark." "What?" Mr. Colton said. "A shark," Chet repeated. "Has there been another attack on the shore?" Mr. Colton said. "I didn't see anything in the newspaper." Chet shook his head. "There's a shark in the creek," he said. "I saw it. It crashed into me." The crowd erupted into laughter. Mr. Colton offered a sympathetic smile and a hand on his shoulder. "It's the heat, my boy. It's driving us all a little mad." He asked one of the customers to go into the back and bring Chet a drink. He led Chet through the laughing crowd and sat him on the stool behind the counter. A man handed Chet a tin mug of water. "Take a drink, son," Mr. Colton said, but Chet pushed it away, and water splashed onto a pile of seed catalogs. "We have to warn people." But Mr. Colton shook his head, like Chet was a little kid who was sure he'd seen a unicorn galloping down the sidewalk. "There's so much garbage floating in the creek," Mr. Colton said. "It could have been a plank from the dock, or a barrel, or a—" "No," Chet said. "It was a shark." "I think maybe all those pranks are getting to you," Mr. Colton said. Chet knew that he must sound crazy, that he could spend all day swearing that he'd seen a shark. Nobody would believe him. And why would they? A shark in the creek? It was impossible. Except that Chet had seen it with his own eyes. If he'd been a step slower, he'd be dead right now. Another name in the newspaper. "It's all right, son," Mr. Colton said. "How about I call Dr. J and he'll give you a ride home? You've never been in his motor car, have you?" Mr. Colton headed to the back of the store to use the telephone. The customers drifted away, shaking their heads and chuckling. Nobody would believe it. Meanwhile, that shark was still in the creek. And then it hit Chet that there was one person in town who just might believe him, who might know what to do. He wasn't sure, but it was his best hope. He slid off the stool and rushed out of the store. "Chet," Mr. Colton called. "Where are you going?" Chet didn't turn around. He had to find Captain Wilson. He'd wasted enough time already.
The summer of 1916 was a beautiful, innocent age, and the Jersey Shore was the place to be at that time.
Well, this well-educated, charming young man, Charles Van Sant, the doctor's son from Philadelphia, decides to take an early evening swim as soon as the family lands in Beach Haven.
Come on, boy.
Van Sant beckons a dog on the beach. His friend, lifeguard Alex Haas, is on the lookout, but Van Sant prides himself on being a strong swimmer. The dog swims back to shore, but Van Sant stays in the water. Swims out a ways, not too far, but or so. All of a sudden, he starts screaming. This blood-curdling scream drifts along the shore.
Van Sant is struck with an astonishing force. impact probably akin to a Mack truck.
The lifeguard springs into action. But it's too late. Van Sant suffers severe blood loss from the gaping wound on his left thigh. He doesn't live long enough to say goodbye.
Because of the severity of Van Zant's wound and the horror of the entire incident, the town of Beach Haven was obviously turned upside down.
The townspeople are stunned, and the scientists are stumped. What could kill a man with such brutal force? There are all kinds of crazy theories, from a great sea turtle to German U-boats firing off torpedoes. No one points to the most likely culprit, a shark. Back in 1916, they simply weren't thought of as killers.
That's all I have for today. So next week we will finish the story and I will give you the AR quiz number. Until then, I will attach a read room down below this. If you would like to read a little bit more on your own, that's fine with me. But if not, go take a break, get some juice, wiggle around a little bit, and meet your teacher for some more fantastic learning.